for the 5th edition of the Oando webinar series. My name is Demola Ogunbanjo. I will be moderating today's session, and we will be speaking about COVID-19 and how we can vaccinate the shadow pandemic. And with me today to do justice to this subject are experts in their respective fields and people who have done and continue to do a lot of work in seeing to it that the shadow pandemic is something that is brought to light, but not just spoken about, but also, engage meaningfully and have action, against. So I have Dr. Oliver Stope. Dr. Oliver Stope is the country representative of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Oliver, thank you for joining us. I also have Dr. Kemi Da Silva Ibru. She's a consultant specialist, obstetrics and gynecology. I knew that was going to be a tongue twister for me. And she is also the founder of Women at Risk International Foundation. We also have Dr. Tomiwa Eriosho. Dr. Tomiwa Eriosho is the Chief Technical Officer and co-founder of Town Talk Solutions Incorporated. And last but not the least, Tosin Akibo, who is a technical coherence specialist at the United Nations and European Union Spotlight Initiative. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for making the time. And I'm looking forward to a very informative session with you. We have chosen to speak today about the shadow pandemic, which we all know speaks to gender-based violence and all forms of violence against women and girls. And that is because historically, we know these are social ills that have been there, but recently over the last 15 months since the pandemic hit, particularly during the lockdown, data that we have seen shows that there's been a spike in gender-based violence. There's been a spike in sexual assault, physical violence, whether it's sexual or not. And a number of us see these things as numbers, right? We hear that 1 in every 3 women globally have experienced at one time or the other, whether it's physical assault or sexual assault from an intimate partner. And these things, sound to most of us as numbers. I'm particularly worried by that statistic because I've got 2 daughters, right? And I have 2 nieces. So you're saying that if I bring my 2 daughters and my 2 nieces together, I should pay attention because perhaps one of them's been assaulted already, based on the data that we've seen, because it shows as well that 1 out of every 4 girl child, might have been sexually assaulted, at one point or the other. But to make sense of this, Tosin, I'm coming to you first. Beyond the numbers, what exactly are you seeing? What are we dealing with? What should we know? And what is the agenda of the Spotlight Initiative?
Thank you very much, Demola, and good morning, co-panelists, and to our distinguished listeners. You have asked a very pertinent question, Demola, and I'm going to give you an example in numbers. So, last year, February of 2020, just before the declaration of the lockdown in March, in some of the total of 24 states, as at February of 2020, had reported roughly 390 cases or incidences of gender-based violence. But by the middle of April, just 2 weeks after lockdown, gender-based violence incidences had spiked to 794 from less of the total number that I had reported earlier, that had reported in February. In some instances, some of our centers that had had interacted with about 5 at the beginning of 2020. By the middle of April, we're seeing 100 either reported cases or persons that had to just leave the house and find a way to get to the centers. So I like how you started and said, sometimes we see these numbers as numbers, but we see them as people, young girls. In one of our centers, we just during the lockdown, we set up a center in Sokoto called the Nana Khadija Center, and it kickstarted operations in March. And the first case that was reported was that of a 2-year-old that had been completely violated. That is someone's daughter. That is someone's niece. And so when we talk about the shadow pandemic on the joint EU-UN Spotlight Initiative, it's not business as usual. It's the largest global funding on eliminating violence against women and girls. And so several things were kickstarted at the same time during the 2020 COVID-19 incident, ranging from engaging with critical stakeholders like government, like the private sector, like institutions, setting up one-stop centers, engaging directly through women's movement with the presidential task force. Because at the beginning of that lockdown, there wasn't any concrete plan in place to attend to incidences of gender-based violence because there was complete lockdown. People were shut in seemingly with the enemy. You know, the perpetrator and the victim would go out in the morning. Usually you come back at night, but suddenly you're home 24 hours and you're seeing each other. And so violence prevailed. And so because people couldn't access services, they would get to the road, the police would turn them back. The women's movement came together and under the joint EU-UN Spotlight Initiative, came up with a joint statement that had almost 300 signatures across Nigeria to the presidential task force saying, we need gender-based violence to be recognized as gender-based violence response to be recognized as an essential service. And that was done that same week. At that point, we could open our one-stop centers. At that point, people could access services. And so it brings to bear the discussion for today. How do we bring together the public and private sector to address issues of violence against women, to address the shadow pandemic? As mentioned, when we had a discussion with a couple of friends, the shadow pandemic will not go away unless we all jointly work together. There may be another pandemic beyond COVID-19. The better prepared we are now, the better prepared we will be to respond to issues of violence against women when that next pandemic comes. Over to you, Demola, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Chelsea. Sometimes, you would feel like you know these things. I credit myself for studying a lot, and then you hear people who are on the field talk about what they see. I mean, the first thing to do really is to commend your resilience. I do not know how I would react to a situation where a 2-year-old has been violated, But I mean, to go to Kemi, you founded Women at Risk in 2016. What did you see and what were you hoping to achieve?
Well, first, I want to say hello to you, Demola. Thank you very much for having me this morning. I would like to say hello to all my other panelists and everyone that's listening. As you rightly said, I established the nonprofit WARIF, the Women at Risk International Foundation, in 2016. But I've been working with women as my target audience for 20 years, being a practicing consultant gynecologist. And working in the public space in Nigeria, the very first thing you recognize are the disenfranchised girls and women being seen many a time in public sector hospitals. Only very recently have we started to establish specialized sexual assault referral centers. And I would say we still only have 17. But having said that, I started out being a practicing gynecologist, witnessing firsthand the cases that Tosin rightly alluded to. I have taken that 2-year-old into the operating room that was violated by her father. I've taken that 60-year-old woman that was raped in her home. And I've seen many women between those two ages. So recognizing that you have a prevalent problem and appreciating that in spite of the fact that we do have infrastructure, we needed more. And this is why I decided that I would throw my hat in. I would establish a foundation that would clearly have established guidelines and deliberate mandates in addressing a problem that had such a huge magnitude. Warriors was established 4 years ago, and in tackling the problem, we've recognized that everyone needs a problem and has so many overlaying aspects to it. You need a roadmap, otherwise you get absorbed and you get overwhelmed by it. Now, our roadmap was very simple: health, education, service. Tackling health is intervention. So the Rape Crisis Center, the one-stop center that Tosin alluded to, we have one, we've established one. That's free care, that's forensics, that's medical care, that's counseling. And then social welfare, because Nigeria is not a welfare country. So she can't leave her home of abuse because she can't pick up the phone and ask for shelter. And so we had to address needs. And they have, because sadly, women make poor choices because they are financially constrained. And then education, because we had to prevent the issue. And you start with the adolescent age, because as you rightly said, they're the most prevalent in terms of the most vulnerable. You mentioned the 1 in 4, but you didn't add the fact that this was before the age of 18. And with boys, it's 1 in 8 before the age of 18. And then you work your way up into the tertiary institutions, and it's 1 in 5. And then in the communities, Nigeria is still 54% rural. We might expend a lot of time and energy investing in the way we look at the breadth of a problem, and obviously it will fast track that are necessary. Because in those access anything else but the services and programs you take to them. That's why we incorporate community service programs into our model, and that's essentially the holistic approach that we've adopted in tackling and addressing the problem.
Thanks, Kemi. So here's the thing. Tosin spoke earlier about, the severity of the issues. You've confirmed this as well. You ladies see these cases on the daily. And to Tosin's point, during the lockdown, there had to be a movement to compel the government to identify services to these victims as essential. Absolutely. Which means it wasn't so listed before. Is it because they do not have access to the data, they're not aware of what's going on in the fields? Why did that have to be the case?
Well, I think historically, violence women has been a recognized problem globally. We speak of 250 million women before the pandemic globally, where we speak of 40 women when you look at women between the ages of 15 and 49. The shadow pandemic increased the number of cases because, yes, women were now trapped at home with their abusers. And there was, and it still is, a heightened state of anxiety with health and with financial insecurities. So if you have a violent home and you have these factors in play, it sets a perfect storm for repeated abuse. And these cases are well documented. At our center, we saw a 64% increase in the number of calls made to our helpline in the first lockdown back in March of 2020. So these cases are available in terms of data. Sadly, the data is not cohesive. And admittedly, the data is only more recently being collated. And so it's only now that we have a more sort of global and panoramic view, if you will, across Nigeria as to the sheer extent of the problem. Was there assistance before? Yes, But as Tosin mentioned, for example, we never had gender-based violence as an essential service. Prior to June of 2020, that was the very first time that the federal government recognized and called a state of emergency to rape. So the problem was always prevalent, but the COVID pandemic has brought this up and has made everyone recognize that we are living in a culture that's steeped in this rape culture. And we do have these numbers that amount to 10,000 girls every day somewhere across Nigeria being raped.
Wow. Thanks, Kemi. Now, talking about culture and data, Tomiwa, I'm coming to you. So first off, as we know, we have a culture of, that's a little quiet, on the side of, not reporting cases, because there's the stigma that is attached to, these cases, whether it is violence at home, whether it is rape cases, whatever it is, we have a culture of covering some of these things up because, we're often ashamed that these things happen to us out of no fault of the victims. And then Kemi has spoken to the fact that the data, yes, always there, but there's no cohesion. There hadn't been until recently that panoramic view to, looking at what the cases are, where they are, what can be done. And I know, Tomiwa, that your work looks at synthesizing the data, using artificial intelligence to engage, on the one hand, the issue of culture and the need to find a way to engage services without appearing physically at first until people are comfortable. And so with the work that you do with AI and, data analysis, Tomiwa, how much mileage would you say you have gained since you started? And, what can we hope to begin to see, in this regard?
Thank you very much, Demola, for that question. You've essentially wrapped my thoughts and essentially made my submission a lot easier. I think just to touch on the points you raised, you spoke, I guess, a bit about the stigma. I think that's a critical factor. The two previous speakers also spoke about the overflow of reports and incidents since, particularly since the pandemic and the lockdowns commenced. And then there are two other areas I would like to touch on, which of course will include difficulty in accessing support in light of COVID-19 and physical mobility restrictions, which of course means that even if you have assault centers or response centers, it's also sometimes difficult to access them. And then also importantly is, given that we have very limited resources, we also have to spread our resources across multiple people. So we essentially need to have some level of prioritization. So our work at Town Talk, last year, we partnered with the Social Science Academy of Nigeria, who have a track record of addressing gender issues. But also, we could now essentially, Town Talk as a technology company could use technology to operationalize support provision in gender-based violence cases. What does that mean in particular? That means that we have essentially adopted a technical framework that can help us operationalize and provide or address a lot of the issues that you have raised. And what's this technical framework? If for the academics, we call it the Psychosocial Support for Emergency Situations framework. But what that means is there are 4 layers of support that you can provide to survivors. And these are the 4 layers. The first layer, which is the base layer, is your ability to advocate for right protecting, dignity protecting spaces. What does that mean? That means being able to ensure that the survivor can access support conveniently, in a right protected way, in a dignity protecting way, removing some of the stigma. So for example, you go to the police station and they say, you say you were harassed, and the policeman says, or the police officer says, why were you wearing what you were wearing? And so we want to cut out some of those stigmas and comments that are associated, and how we are doing this by essentially deploying a range of technologies. So a mobile application for reporting incidents of gender-based violence, as well as other security incidents, because again, security is a totality. We built a USSD application, *347*0# that helps you, brings you into this ecosystem of support, and of course is able to reach people in remote communities. And we are essentially setting up, we have a toll-free line, and we are setting up a small call center, which is constantly scaling, but because we have a lot of technology, we can limit how fast it scales. And so those are some of the basic advocates, basic tools that we use to eliminate this or address this issue of stigma. When we, and the idea behind that is being able to provide all these reporting channels so that even if you are limited by COVID-19 mobility restrictions, you are still able to access support. For people that are beginning to access this support channel and basic services, which of course I forgot to mention, includes connecting with the nearest emergency service, telling you which number to call, which is the nearest one. All these are available information empowerment that we're doing. Now we can then pass you on to the next layer of the pyramid, which is essentially activating these support spaces. Now, you may Dr. Da Silva and Mrs. Tosin mentioned, the setting up of all these physical support spaces. But again, these are high-risk spaces in light of COVID-19. So what we essentially did, and I know Warif is doing, also have like a call center, but what we're essentially doing is to have support spaces where we're running a call center that can provide support to survivors. But what we also realized, and I'm sure Dr. Da Silva will agree with me, is that even the call center can be overwhelmed sometimes with cases. So what we are doing from an AI perspective is to essentially deploy intelligent technologies like interactive voice response systems that are essentially active, that are locally contextual in different languages in Nigeria, and are scalable and can reach a vast swath of Nigeria's population and provide access to support very quickly. We're able to do this, and that essentially operationalizes and makes the support process a lot more efficient. When you access these support spaces with the case officers who can listen to your case in a non-judgmental, non-stigmatized way, we are then able to provide some psychosocial support or take them to the next layer of the pyramid. That's the third layer of the 4-layer pyramid, which is referring them to what we call our third-party partners, which is a broad name for a lot of the NGOs, the state support services like the Domestic and Sexual Violence Response Team in Lagos, the NGOs like Warif, and all the other NGOs that are doing a lot of very good work providing support. Now, we can't handle all the cases, but we are essentially acting as the first line of emergency. Then we pass them on to emergency support, and then we pass them on to the folks that do a lot of physical support. But remember, we've already gone through 2 layers, which has removed stigma, has filtered cases, has provided a lot of information, and then passed on to the support services. And that also includes the hospitals and other primary healthcare centers. And the last layer of the pyramid, essentially, is taking people that have accessed this support, either from the NGOs, to a higher level of support, which could be a mental health expert. For example, to essentially talk you through or to provide you with advanced support. This whole value chain of support that I've just laid out is technology driven. It's technology backed. It's all scalable, and essentially provides us with a way of capturing data from start to finish. And what that essentially means, in principle, is that we are able to take that data, we're able to synthesize it, we're able to design solutions to help us operationalize and eliminate some of the bottlenecks that require human support. And we're able to have all this data in a coordinated way. And I'll end here by saying that what we end up realizing is a lot of the data we are receiving, a lot of the tools and the feedback we have received from a lot of our partners is that, yes, there's been a lot of effort you have champions individual champions doing a lot of work, but what we're essentially doing is that we're trying to bring everybody onto the same page, trying to create a framework for support and trying to create technology tools that help us deliver this support across the support value chain. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Samuel. Before I go to Oliver, and I'm coming to you, Oliver, to speak about, these are serious issues, right? But we can't continue to look at the symptoms only. We need to dig deep and look at, what the root causes may be. Looking at the work that your organization does and some of the work that you have done locally as well. Let's look at, some of the elements that feed into the, the situation that we're in. There's literally no other way to put it. Is it drugs? Is it the economy? Is it, poverty, that is? Is it, what is it? Is it depression of some sort? Is it mental, illness? Whatever it is, but before that, so that's just to prep you, for what I'm going to ask you to speak to. Tosin, you wanted to say something about, I think it was what Kemi spoke about before I went to Tomiwa.
Thank you very much, Demola. And I'm going to start from the last point you made. There is no justification for perpetrating violence against women and girls, as you rightly said. Let's take a few steps back to talking about what exactly is gender-based violence. This is violence perpetrated as a result of your gender. And so I like giving examples. I'm also a storyteller. So you perceive that my role in the society as a woman is one of subservience, one that lives and dies in the kitchen, one that if I dare move out of that box that you have placed me, then you have the right to perpetrate some level of violence against me that will put me back into the right thinking that I was supposed to have. So that's why you see, because we live in a patriarchal society, we have incidences where you hear, he beats me because I put too much salt in the food. You hear phrases like, see him driving like a woman. And so when you see a woman that drives, in quotes, like a man, someone feels intimidated or tries to put the woman in her place. Or you hear things like, why did you allow the baby cry? If you're a good mother, your baby shouldn't cry. So there really isn't any justification. There really isn't any excuse. Or why do you rape a 3-month-old until you rip her intestines out? On what basis? What did she do? Was it indecent dressing? Or because she only had Pampers on? So the cause of gender-based of violence against women is the perpetrator. Of course, there are social ills, and I'm glad Dr. Oliver is here. There are a lot of social ills, and I'm sure he'll be talking about those. But the main cause, the main reason for perpetration of sexual violence or violence against women and girls is the perpetrator themselves. The shame is on the perpetrator themselves. The onus is on the perpetrator not to perpetrate violence against women. And let me talk a bit about men. Demola, you know that in the society we live in, the man is perceived as breadwinner, as the one that bears the burden of the family. And so if in a certain circumstance is unable to do that, and the woman starts reminding him of his duties that he cannot perform and using the neighbor as an example of how he just bought a car for his wife, that is verbal abuse. That's one form of domestic violence, right? I knew you were going to smile about that. So, but you see, the incidences of violence against women in our society they're rife because people have certain expectations of certain genders. And once you step outside of that expectation, they want to put you back in your place. That's why someone that got married, made their vows, would batter the person they swore heaven and earth that they love. And at the end of the day, somebody dies because they felt, oh, you're making more money than I am. So I have the right to do what I have to do. I'm the man of the house. Now there's a question around explaining what the shadow pandemic means. And if you give me 1 minute, Demola, I'll quickly run through that.
Go ahead.
Now, the shadow pandemic is a pandemic within a pandemic. So a case in point is when we had the COVID-19 incident that was raging worldwide, and is still raging. But another pandemic that was raging underneath that a lot of women were getting killed was violence against women and girls. And so the reason why it was called, or it is called, the shadow pandemic is because it's not as you said, it's not what you see being said, or that government policies are now focused solely on preventing violence against women. And so because we want to spotlight it, because we want attention, we know that the more we talk, the more we find common ground. We want to keep talking about it. There is a shadow pandemic just beneath the main pandemic. And if we do not do anything about it, and I'd like to say it here, that private sector organizations that are prescient will realize that getting on their feet to prevent and respond in collaboration with government, to prevent and respond to violence against women, will put themselves in a pedestal that others may not find themselves in the nearest future. And so private sector organizations that want to be relevant should begin to talk, should begin to act around prevention and response to gender-based violence. And I know we'll come back to that, so I don't hold the discussions on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tosin. The passion with which you engage these issues, unparalleled, right? So, Oliver, like Tosin has, highlighted, this is called the shadow pandemic because whilst we're focusing on COVID, which is what everybody, can see, there are, other ills going on behind the curtain, essentially. But there are other issues lurking in the shadows that have reached pandemic status. What are these issues? How do they contribute to, gender-based violence from your point of view? And how can we begin to take a holistic look at, dealing with these, issues? Because there are two levers to pull here. There's the one lever of intervention, where there are already victims, reducing that and, just supporting them and, helping out. And then there's a second level of ensuring that we attack the root cause so much that we reduce it significantly, or, to meet Kemi's organization's target of zero, that's absolute eradication by 2030, right? So what do we need to do? What should we look out for as the signs that, you see, Oliver?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Even though the topic is not a pleasant one to discuss, I think we need to be very honest about that. I don't think I have a full-fledged answer to you, because I think we would be digging into historic, cultural, basically, reasons, economic reasons, psychosocial reasons that are really very complex and multifaceted. But I think there's one important thing that I've not heard yet coming out as clearly as I would wish to, which is really the issue of impunity. Essentially, we need to be very clear Tosin said it very well. Obviously, the problem is the perpetrator, but everybody talked about the victim so far, essentially. We need to also start focus on the perpetrator and those resources that the state needs to be putting in place in order to actually address the situation of the perpetrator in terms of their criminal justice accountability. I'm not calling for the death penalty or any of that kind of extremism that sometimes comes into this discussion. And I think that is just as unhelpful as basically the wish, so to speak, to only address the needs of the victim. We need a criminal justice system that is basically equipped, first and foremost, with well-trained individuals, professionals, whether we're talking about the frontline officers, very often the beat policeman that essentially is the first one on the scene. How do they react to a situation of domestic, of gender, or of sexual-based violence, alleged or actually in process? Then we have the issue of the people in the police station, most notably the investigators. Are they trained actually in doing the right thing, collecting the evidence, and very importantly, not re-victimizing the victim in the process? Of course, prosecutors and judges, very importantly, do they have the necessary laws to actually establish the protection, for example, of the victims? I think we have at the moment a situation where essentially gender-based violence offenses are generally bailable. That means even in the case that everything goes well up to that stage, that alleged perpetrator of the gender-based violence will, after a short while in cell, pay their bail or have a shorty standing in for them. And the judges do not have necessarily neither the training nor necessarily the laws in order to prevent actually the perpetrator from going back to exactly the same place where the offense was committed, his home. So there's all these kind of layers that I think are contributing to quite some weak response as a society. And let's not forget that the criminal justice, the victim support is one part of the response of us as a society. The other one is basically holding the perpetrators to account. And we are doing actually a poor job on both ends. And therefore, we should not be so surprised that we are actually seeing across all societies. This is, I think, something very interesting to see. We have done a global study just now. It came out literally a month ago, where we looked at the criminal justice response across the globe. And we saw a lot of parallel developments, similarities, and quite shockingly, actually, often, while, of course, there were some differences between more developed, so to speak, countries and countries in the process of development. But the truth is, the general trend of gender-based violence persists. Actually, it was France, I think, that was the very first country that raised the alarm about the raising the cases of gender-based violence, the call into the hotlines, and of course, the victimized women, mostly women and girls, essentially coming forward to the centers, the shelters, and so on. So we see this across basically the globe, and we have been not very good at responding at that part. And that is, I think, also something that in the context of Nigeria is very important. And that comes, of course, at a moment when we see actually a sort of like competition for priorities. On the one hand, the police is being asked to, as a result of the pandemic, to tackle a whole range of additional challenges. We have a general raise of insecurity that, of course, keeps the police busy. At the same time, we will actually see government, because of the general economic downturn, having less money to invest into the criminal justice system in order to perform its functions. We have issues of access, just as we had issues of access to the centers for victims to obtain protection, obtain support. We also had issues of access to the courts. We had problems of accessing police stations. The courts were actually shut down essentially, except for a couple of really core functions for a couple of months. Even police stations were at some point telling citizens not to come to the police station. So all these things come together, and I think we need to really look very critical and analytically at essentially these various sort of weaknesses that have been evidenced during the pandemic in terms of the criminal justice response to gender-based violence, and really try to start addressing them bit by bit, because it's really a building, it's a chain that needs to be basically restored in a sense, is at least as far as we're talking about gender-based violence.
Thank you, Oliver. I know that you've done a lot of work around institutional strengthening in Nigeria, particularly in the justice system. And I was going to ask earlier, and I guess this is a good time to do so. Based on your own engagement and analysis of our justice system, yes, let's look at the limitations of the lockdown and the pandemic and all of that. Take all of that out. How ready would you say we are to tackle this headlong? I mean, we hear about 137 women are killed every day due to some violence, whether it's from an intimate partner or just a family member. I mean, does it have to become a homicide before we engage it as seriously as we should? Or, so how, based on your own work, your own direct observation, engagement, how ready are we to, deal with this as a country, speaking to Nigeria now specifically?
I think, unfortunately, we're not very ready. I think that is the truth. Not that other places don't face very similar challenges. I think we need to be very fair here. But certainly in the context of Nigeria, we face a couple of very peculiar challenges. And one of the challenges actually that I do think are maybe not observed quite as strongly as they should be is the problem of the gender composition of our criminal justice system. Only about 30% of the judges are women. If you look at the leadership in the judiciary, it's far less. In the case of the police, it's less than 20% of police officers are women. Hardly any frontline officers are women. So we have quite problems here in terms of the composition. If we look at other countries, many try actually to have, for example, the general rule that every patrol is essentially gender balanced. So every team that goes out there is a man and a woman, exactly for that reason, that there are situations where essentially crime affects, and I'm not talking only now about gender-based violence, but crime affects women and men in a very different way, and therefore also this response needs to be very different. And in order for that response to be most accurate, so to speak, and most helpful to the victims of crime, that composition, that mixed composition basically of the patrol is absolutely critical. And there's so many more elements, of course, that come into play due to the lack of gender equality and gender equal distribution inside our criminal justice system.
Interesting. Thank you for that. To the audience, I understand that there will be a poll in the chat room, so look out for that and participate, please. And then put your questions not in the chat room, but in the Q&A section, so that I can at least take some of your questions for the panelists. But I'll go from Oliver straight to Kemi here. Kemi, you have essentially, put your money where your mouth is, all right? And you engage this challenge on the daily. Here's my question. What are your most common challenges, and what kind of support do you want to see from government? Do you want to see from the private sector, individuals as well, people like myself and the people in the audience, multilateral organizations like the UNODC? What more? What do you want us to do? From the policy angle, that's on the government side, from the private sector, from individuals, from multilateral, organizations. What do you want to see?
Well, I think first off, for us to address this problem, we need to recognize some of the challenges that have led to the problem. One of the fundamental challenges that we face in the space is just that shared lack of awareness. We touched on the fact that we're patriarchy. We didn't touch on the fact that we're very cultural. We have cultural practices that encourage these harmful acts against women. And we didn't touch on the fact that we have communities that are enabling. So we have survivors that are shamed because of these acts of violence. So you have to look at it through the lens of the survivor. The act occurs, and in your home, because 90% of the time we know the perpetrator is usually well known to the survivor, possibly a family member, you're already asked to keep silent about it. And then you move out of your home and you're ostracized if you speak out. And then the community turns on you because you have spoken out. And as you rightly said, then you look around looking for infrastructure to assist you because you need healthcare, but you have limited healthcare because of the lack of healthcare and infrastructure in place. You want to seek justice. You have challenges because you have law enforcement that are not sensitized. You have laws that are antiquated or not cohesive. And then you have laws and policies and lawmakers that don't address your problem front and center. So what do you do? And this is the challenge that each survivor faces daily. So what I'm asking, we need to have coordination of all our public services across all our states, our health, our justice, law enforcement, and social welfare services, because that's the only way that we can actually see a shift in the needle. We have laws, and I'm sure probably Oliver or even Tosi may speak of the Vap Act. This is an act that we've spoken of day in, day out. We've established it. It's an amended law. It works. It covers the bases. It talks about rape. It talks about all the other aspects of gender-based violence. But unfortunately, as we speak, only 23 states out of 36 have domesticated it. We talk about child abuse, and we say we need to protect the child. We know this. I've mentioned personally having to treat children. Tosin has mentioned in her other center, a 2-year-old. But then we have a Child's Right Act that only 25 states have domesticated across the country, and this is from 2003. We have a National Offenders Registry. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Demola, from last year. It's documented 602 cases, 38 have been convicted. In Lagos State, one of the more progressive states, we have a special sexual offense court. But how about the other 35 states? And I mentioned sexual assault referral centers. We have 30 of them across 17 states. But in Lagos alone, we have 4. And we've had 8 new ones since 2020. There has to be a cohesion with all the actors in play. It's not just one governmental problem or one civil society addressing this. And as you said, it starts with the individual, taking ownership of the problem in the community, allowing that survivor to speak out, giving her that platform from her home. People speak of even the way we bring up our children, the fact that we allow our boys to be brought up entitled, and we encourage our girls to be subservient in the house and to be silent. How about we start there, appreciating the equality as the child is born and giving those children, whether it's a boy or a girl, equal opportunities. We talk about policy. How about recognizing that beyond having that lovely roadmap, we need to implement the policy? At the organization, Oliver mentioned police officers. Lagos, for instance, we have family support units. that are specially trained to address gender cases, but they're only 12. And we're 21 million people in Lagos alone. This is one of the reasons why we actually established a gender sensitization program for police officers. I believe we've trained up to about 900 of them and counting, because that's an aspect that is critical in addressing the issue. Tosin mentioned that yes, perpetrators are the underlying cause because rape occurs because of rapists. And you're right, it does occur, and they will continue with impunity, except we all make deliberate efforts to ensure that they don't. And it starts in the community and then works its way out, ensuring that all the different aspects of public services are tackling the problem cohesively and in a deliberate fashion.
Wow. Thank you, Kemi. Tosin, yes, I was coming to you, and I know you were waiting for me. So here's the thing. Clearly, from what Kemi has said, there's a lot of psychological operations that need to go on.
Yes.
Designing communications, some of it legislation as well.
Yes.
And I speak to, simple nuances, like the famous advert of some telco, Mamana Boy. All right.
Mamana Boy.
Yeah, that's some gender, nuance, right? Right there.
Yes.
And then I have seen memes on social media where people will joke about, oh, look at these beautiful ladies. They raped this guy. Please, where are they? They need to rape me as well. All right.
Yes.
We turn it into a joke.
Yes.
There's this Okebakasi's joke, one of the most popular, that is, and funny, yes, it is. But when you look at the message, it's trivializing rape, going through what Tomiwa had spoken, to earlier about the police asking you, so what were you wearing? So you met at the club, and then you went to his house, and then you took a shower, and then you wore his shirt, and then till they make, they just ridicule the entire experience, and then before you know it, it's turned into some kind of victim shaming. But these are serious issues. These are not issues to laugh about, right? So how do we engage social media and all other communication, platforms to ensure that we counter, the narrative that's out there? That's on the one hand. And how do we influence legislation to ban, whether it's Nollywood or the corporate sector, from putting out adverts that promote one gender above the other? I was watching this film, it was a couple of days ago, some Nigerian film, and the lady was pregnant, went to see her aunt, and they were quite happy because she had tried for many years, and, and then when she now said, oh, it's a boy, the whole place erupted, like, oh my God. And everybody started dancing like, it's going to be Jesus' second coming. So how do we remove those elements out of the materials that go out there from the legislation point of view, and engage social media and other communication, platforms as well, and just, redirect the narrative to what it should be?
Thank you very much, Demola. You have unpacked a lot of things, and I'll try to grapple with them within the given time. Just to add to what you said, I hope you know that in some societies, once a woman gets pregnant, before they announce to anybody, they go to check what the sex of the baby is. And if it's a girl, they take it out. It's called infanticide, because the society frowns. It didn't happen. It didn't stop last year. It's still happening right now. And so you'd see that on the joint EU-UN Spotlight Initiative, we, as I mentioned earlier, it's not business as usual, where we talk, and there is no action. In the phase 2 of this project, we have plans, very solid plans, to work with the Actors Guild of Nigeria to support the process of reviewing the content. What is it that we put out there to Nigerians? People watch TV a lot. People watch African Magic a lot. And so that is one viable way of getting the attention of the community. Another thing is that the public and private sector should expand their collaborative efforts. At the beginning, I was going to ask you that, do you know the cost of violence against women in Nigeria? If we sit down and calculate it, there was a study recently that that showed the average cost for a victim of gender-based violence is about 17,000 naira. This includes hospital minus legal costs. Dr. Kemi mentioned that we have a lot of legislation. We have the VAP, we have the Child Rights Act, but do we have monitoring tools in place to ensure that they are not only implemented, they are enforced, and that they're used in the right way? Social media is there. It is a strong, viable weapon. It is a medium that cannot go away in a hurry. You see hashtags. You saw the recent one about the lady who unfortunately passed on in the hands of someone who tricked her to say she should come for a job. And within an hour of her friend putting up an SOS, people had tracked this suspect to where he was. And before you knew it, there was an uproar. How can we harness this new media to be able to direct our narrative, to be able to support society to shift harmful stereotypes? I like what Tomiwa said. We're moving away from, hello, my husband just beat me now, to being able to just tap a button on your phone. Whether you're a woman with one disability or the other, you can seek for help. But we cannot get there if that collaborative effort does not take place. There has to be that time when private sector and government comes together beyond collaborative effort on joint initiatives. Can we set up a GBV fund that covers laws and policies, strengthening institutions, prevention, which is at the community level, social media engagement, service provision, data collation for funding purposes, for information purposes, and strengthening women's movement, strengthening the coalition within the country. So it is very possible to use social media. It is currently being used, but we're not doing it enough. And until critical stakeholders come together to make it intentional. On the joint EU-UN Spotlight Initiative, for example, we will be engaging with the Federation of Women's Female Footballers of Nigeria to see their football matches going on, their adverts that run through the field. What do we want to say using that opportunity? I know some people would not sleep until they watch football. And if their team loses, they're sick for 1 month. And so they get information from that engagement. But as my colleagues, my co-panelists have said, the problem of gender-based violence is multi-sectoral, is multifaceted, and so must be the solution for it. Yes, we must look at laws and policies. We must look at institutions, prevention, service provision, data collection, garnering coalitions to make sure that we prevent and respond to this. Thank you, Demola.
Thank you, Sosi. And it's so painful. I don't know how we'll do this. 1 hour does not do justice to this conversation. And there's a question from someone in the audience, I think Bobby Odusi, and this basically speaks to the fact that we know that hurt people, all right? And, they say they don't believe that someone who's not sick can rape a 2-year-old or a 7-year-old. And yes, I agree with you, absolutely. There is no excuse for it. Whether it's violence, whether it's assault, whatever it is, there's no excuse, okay? However, and Tomiwa, I want you to take a stab at this. As we're looking at the interventions, how can we, what is it that we can do to address the eradication, to look at the perpetrators and, and identify the sick ones. And, how do we use that angle to reduce the number of incidences and cases? And because yes, it is essential that we focus on the victims, but it is also, I believe, important that we look at the perpetrators and identify the sick ones that need help, and then walk through that as well. I see that Kemi wants to jump on that, but let's have Tomiwa go first, and then Kemi, you can contribute after.
No, thank you very much, Demola. I think broadly we need to declare a state of emergency for gender-based violence, and that we should take it seriously at all levels of individuals, government, family, everywhere. But what does that mean in practice? It means 4 things. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Go on, please, Samuel. It means 4 things.
Yes, it means 4 things. It means 4 things, and data and technical expertise is at the center of everything. The first thing it means is we need to start providing data for preventive action and information empowerment and support. Since COVID started, we took COVID at least relatively seriously. You typically pick up your phone and you would get a message from the NCDC telling you to socially distance, to go to, if you don't feel well, go to a particular hospital. But we don't get such messages around changing perceptions and biases and norms against gender-based violence. One of the panelists mentioned, that yes, I think it was Dr. Stoll that mentioned that a lot of the women are barely at the front lines. We have a small fraction of women who are in the police force who are actually delivering support. But you'll be surprised that actually there's a lot of bias amongst women themselves, and there's also a need for reorientation, information empowerment to women too, because they themselves are already biased towards the stereotypes of gender-based violence, and sometimes they are actually the ones that exacerbate this situation. So I think that's the first thing that needs to be done. The second thing that needs to be done is to again deploy data and technology to address the issues of coherence, forensics, and essentially building a data-driven case. So we should be able to have DNA evidence being used to convict perpetrators. We should be able to have the expertise to have digital timestamps to put a particular person, a particular survivor at a particular place. One of the issues that we again face sometimes is being able to get a survivor to recount a coherent timeline of what has happened. And so that's usually used by the perpetrator's defense to say, well, the stories don't add up. But typically that's already a problem because the person is probably traumatized and might miss time. So again, data and technology should be able to help to address and resolve some of these challenges around digital location-based timestamps and putting people at the right place, forensics around DNA and things like that. The third thing is we need to, again, build technical expertise around analytics or analytical expertise around case building. So of course, when a case gets into the justice system, it goes to get support, and then of course it gets passed on to a Department of Public Prosecution, who then have to build a case. But again, as we probably have seen through in the social media for a very popular case right now, you have situations where it's almost like a media trial, so to speak. We should be able to build a watertight and solid case. And that again requires a lot of expertise, it requires a lot of data. And what tends to happen is data is sometimes lost across different sectors and different players. Again, we've sort of said that we need a multi-sectoral and collaborative approach, and we need data and technologies that help us consolidate where the data sits, so that when you're building your case, you do not have oversight. And then the last point, the fourth point essentially is the data that we have captured from all these three steps will really help us in terms of shaping policy in each location, making the policy locally contextual, but also really measuring the impact of policy. In most cases, we say, yes, we have trained numbers here and there. We've, banned, there's this number here that this has happened. But do we have numbers from the most remote parts of the southern part of Nigeria? Or do we have the numbers from the most remote part of the northern part of Nigeria? So for me, all across the value chain, data needs to play a role, technical expertise needs to play a role, and this is the way to operationalize this state of emergency in gender-based violence.
Thank you, Tomiwa. And I like how all your answers have a framework of 4 elements. So makes it easier to understand your thought process and what you're talking about. Now, Kemi, so what I want to do now, because we're completely out of time, I'm coming to Kemi. I will give you 1 minute and 30 seconds to speak to that that other lever that we speak to, that I was talking about, which was about the perpetrators themselves and how we can comb through that population and identify the ones that that need help themselves, right? All in the bid to reduce the number of cases. And then I'll go to Tosin for 1 minute, and then I'll let Oliver have the final 1 minute closing remark as well. So Kemi, over to you.
Okay, so real quick, I think what we need to appreciate is who the perpetrator is. When we live in an environment that focuses on protecting girls and protecting women, we forget that we have to involve and include boys and men in the conversation, because boys and men traditionally are the perpetrators, and they live in the same environment of abuse. So they're socialized in the same violent homes, and so therefore they will grow up to become potential perpetrators. So if you want to tackle the problem, you have to go back to the source, identify the perpetrator and change his narrative or her narrative, be that as it may. So what we do is we focus on that adolescent age group between the ages of 12 and 18. And we implement specialized school programs targeting that age group and changing their mindset. Very quickly, we ran a survey, 1,200 anonymous questionnaires were sent out. Boys between the ages of 12 and 16, Demola, 1 in 5 of them came back saying they would walk away if they see a girl being raped. And the reasons they gave varied from, I wasn't part of the plan to rape her, to what she was wearing. And so this is the mindset of our young. And so if we're going to change the dynamics of the gender-based violence and our rape culture, we have to change his narrative. So the Boys Conversation Cafe is one of the programs that we implement across the country. And we're seeing tracked, measured change, because these are boys that are now taking ownership of this problem. And they're now changing in their mindset and recognizing that they need to protect women and not grow up to become perpetrators. So a big aspect of tackling this issue is preventative. And a big demography that you have to recognize are the boys and men. They must be included. And likewise, we do that with men in rural communities by going into these communities and implementing awareness programs, including all the authoritative stakeholders, the religious leaders, the traditional leaders, the physicians, the traditional birth attendants if they're in rural areas, and law enforcement, because they have to be part of the conversation. And you have to change, maybe not necessarily their mindset because they're grown, but certainly the way they operate in terms of tackling the issues in their communities. Because we all have a, if you will, sway, and we all have a circle of influence. And so each of us has that collective ability and individual responsibility to go back to our circle of influence and have that conversation and change that narrative. Was that a minute and a half?
I wasn't checking.
Well, thank you.
I was caught up in all of it. So thank you for your participation. Now, Tosin, so this is from the audience. This is from Habiba Balogun. And her main worry is the culture of forgiveness, so where a case is found, then the families of the perpetrator and the victim now start to engage, and then, the family on behalf of the victim now forgive the perpetrator, and then they say, oh, don't destroy his life and all of that. Whilst if government policy was different and such cases become government cases, so it now becomes the people against, the perpetrator. So there's nothing for the family to forgive. You just have to go face the music, right? I mean, what's your thoughts around that in 1 minute, Tosin? And what has to be done to make government own, these offenses to the point where it is you against the state? And whilst the victim or the victim's family may forgive you, that's just, that's for, human forgiveness. You still, have to go through, the justice system to answer for your crime.
Thank you very much, Habiba, for the fantastic question, and thank you for relating it to me, Demola. I want to give you a quick scenario. 2 of our states where we're implementing the joint EU-UN Spotlight Initiative, between December of 2019 and December of 2020, between those 2 states, there were 672 cases. Now wait for it. Out of the 672 cases, there were 2 convictions in one state and 1 conviction in the other state, out of 672 cases in the span of 1 year. It is for the family to forgive. It is for the courts and the states to decide what they do with the perpetrator. Please make no mistake that whoever has perpetrated violence against or defiled a minor, it is that person versus the state. The family can forgive. They can offer sacrifices on behalf of that person. It is their own obligation, but it is also the obligation of the state to ensure that justice is served. And how can this be done? I mentioned earlier, the private sector needs to collaborate with the government to ensure access to justice. Cases are in court for 3 years. Cases are in court for 5 years. Apathy sets in. Apathy sets in. And before you know it, forensic evidence is lost. People are tired. The people don't come to court again. So we must support government to have speedy trials. Once it's a case of violence perpetration, we must not sleep on it. We must not sit on it. And how can we get there? It has to be, I don't want to speak my dialect, but perhaps I will for the lack of an English word.
Please do.
Agbajowoni. We must collectively work together to ensure that access is not, justice is not delayed, neither is it denied. Once a case comes in, and in the next few weeks, judgment is passed based on evidence, whether you forgive or offer sacrifices or not is no longer the matter. Justice has been served. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Tosin. For those who do not understand what Agbajowo means, it actually means collaboration. All right, Agbajowo means collaborative efforts. Okay, but I guess the import, of what Tosin wanted to pass on, collaborative efforts would not have cut it. So it had to be Agbajowo. Okay. So speaking to collaboration, Oliver, I'm giving you the final say here. You sit at a global organization, just like Tosin as well. You have seen the country, Nigeria, fight corruption. You are helping us, strengthen the justice system. You're looking at, crimes. You're looking at drugs, whether it's the trafficking of it or the abuse of it. Where does this sit, and how do we move it meaningfully forward, collaboratively? And what what elements must come together for that collaboration to work? Oliver, over to you.
Well, it's a great question, but I think that almost forces me to suggest you might need another seminar because I think you're putting too much pressure on me to now resolve, like, basically, and how do we resolve everything in one sentence? And I have 1 minute or 30 seconds. To tell you the truth, the collaboration bit is very important. It is hugely difficult to achieve. You rightly pointed out, I've been working in Nigeria and with Nigerian institutions for an extended period of time, 20 years almost. And I've always been, well, both fascinated and challenged by the difficulties to achieve domestic coordination and cooperation. And then, of course, it sort of like translates even to the international environment. Though I have to say that sometimes it's almost easier to achieve international cooperation. Now, that is maybe less relevant in cases of gender-based violence, but for example, for human trafficking, hugely important. And there I see often institutions working more seamlessly across borders than, for example, to achieve cooperation at domestic level, when various agencies, for example, need to come together to work together, to share information, to divide labor in a logical way, to not compete with each other, and so on and so forth. And that is something that I think collectively we need to learn. We as development partners need to learn of how to help actually with overcoming this kind of like challenges to domestic coordination. And of course, institutions themselves need to overcome it and see somehow the collective value of achievement more important than the individual agency's achievement. And I think there we have quite some road still to cover. And then there's, of course, many other elements that you touched about now on drugs and corruption and so on. But honestly, don't challenge me to throw those into the mix. I think we have enough to chew on the challenge of gender-based violence. And I think it is very good that we've been focusing our attention really on this specific topic and remain specific, and hopefully that will actually bring upon some good ideas that will eventually induce change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kemi. Thank you, Tomiwa. Thank you, Tosin. Thanks again, Oliver, for taking the time. And the contributions that you have made, very enlightening, empowering as well. As they say, knowledge is empowering. And they say once we know better, we must do better. And as we do better, we become better. So better becomes who we are. I see comments in the chat room asking about organizations that are helping victims. And also if there are numbers to call. So I will say that Oando will ensure that every participant receives an email after this program with a list of those organizations and how they can be contacted, whether it's as a victim or for support, to be provided as well. Well, on that note, I thank you again very much. I have it's difficult to say I have had a really good time because the conversation hasn't been about, fun stuff, but I have spent the last hour, learning meaningful lessons about, the ills that surround us and how we can engage, what we can do even as individuals, especially around changing the narrative, raising our children differently, and, just helping to diffuse that culture of victim shaming and all of that. So thank you very much. You will hear from us again. I don't think we're done talking about this. Enjoy the rest of your day and the week. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.